and thank you for having me along this evening. It's a privilege to be here to speak to all of you. Now let me just get a few things out of the way at the start, first of all. I am not secretly pining for Tony Blair to come back and lead the Labour Party. I do not think that we should stand at the next election on the 1997 manifesto, not least because we've already delivered most of it. I am not going to argue that the last Labour government was perfect, and there are certainly things that we would do differently if we had our time again. But what I am going to argue is that the work that went into ensuring that the Labour Party won an unprecedented 3 elections in a row, that meant we had an unprecedented 13 years of continuous centre-left government in this country, does still have lessons for us today, and is part of how we win again. When I started to get involved in politics in the 1990s, it saw the rise, first of all, of the New Democrats, led by Bill Clinton in the United States, New Labour in the UK, and Die Neue Mitte, led by Gerhard Schröder for the SPD in Germany. And all 3 leaders won elections for their parties after significant periods of a dozen or more years each in the wilderness. This was the politics of the third way, of the centre-left, of progressives, of different labels that were used and that started being called New Labour in the UK by both fans and critics alike. And there's no doubting today that more often than not in the Labour Party the term Blairite is a pejorative, indicating something not sitting within the traditions of the Labour Party, a blip to be dismissed with no meaningful lessons for today. Now, it's true that the New Labour period broke with one Labour tradition, and that was losing. But my argument tonight is that the lessons behind those wins are as important today as they were in delivering those victories at the time, and that Labour's success in the future lies in understanding and embracing the fundamentals of New Labour's political approach. So why are there so many in our party today who seem to spend more time on Twitter obsessed with discrediting the New Labour and its achievements than beating the Tories? After all, independent columnist Steve Richards said recently that you only need to think for 10 seconds to realise that the Blairites don't exist anymore. Now, while this may come as good news to the likes of Len McCluskey and Owen Jones, who seem determined to keep alive some McCarthy-like fear that modernisers are about to snatch defeat away from the jaws of victory for Jeremy Corbyn, what's more important is to look at what is behind Richard's critique, is because it is one of the fundamental misunderstandings of what we mean when we talk about having a New Labour philosophy. Because part of Richard's critique is that Tony Blair's own ideas and arguments have evolved over time, so that, quote, even Tony Blair isn't a Blairite anymore. But this is to miss the point entirely. Of course, the policies Tony Blair was advocating at the 2005 election were different to the ones he advocated in 1997, just as the policies for today should be different again. That's why we were right to deliver a national minimum wage, an ambition of the Labour Party since its founding in 1998, but why we're also right now to campaign for a real living wage. That is the nature of New Labour politics, that we're never satisfied or resting on our laurels. And if you want any better clue than this, just look at the book by Philip Gould, the pollster in the New Labour years, who called his book The Unfinished Revolution. He couldn't have been much clearer. Because being New Labour isn't, as George suggested, being about looking back, but constantly looking forward, questioning the status quo and wanting to go further in delivering progressive change. So I would describe being New Labour as someone who wants the Labour Party to win elections rather than lose them. Now, surely everyone believes that, you would say. But I would argue the crucial difference is entirely about whether you think that the Labour Party used to lose elections because of a fault with the electorate or a fault with ourselves. And one of my favourite quotes that sort of illustrates this is from the party member who said after the 1992 election, "The public have rejected us 3 times in a row now. What's wrong with them?" If we want to be true to our values, we have to be in government to deliver them. That means winning elections, and it is not a betrayal of our values to want to win or even to listen to where the public are and react accordingly. Not pandering on issues such as Europe and immigration, as the Blue Labour thesis goes. We can't promise what we can't deliver, Otherwise, that's how you end up pledging nonsense like the Gordon Brown phrase that we would have British jobs for British workers. But winning means winning over new voters to the fold. If you look at the basic maths, we know that there aren't enough lifelong Labour voters to deliver an election victory. If we look at our low water marks of either 1983 or 2010, the party polled 28 and 29% respectively. That's the level of the vote we can rely on. And one of the myths of the New Labour period was that it was only interested in winning over business or the middle class voters. The biggest increase in Labour vote between 1983 and 1997 wasn't in the AB classes, but in the DE classes. So let's nail the myth once and for all that the reason why working class voters, particularly white working class voters, voted for Thatcher in the 80s or are voting Tory now is because they want a more left-wing Labour Party. So the Labour Party will only win when it wins the votes of those who don't normally identify as Labour. And there are two approaches to this. The New Labour approach is that you have to be winning over, as I say, those who currently are voting Tory. Or you can take the view that there are enough ex-Lib Dems, Greens and young voters that can be mobilised to deliver victory. Now this analysis was the one that certainly gained favour under Ed Miliband, believing that there was an alternative electoral coalition that could deliver us victory, and 2015, an election we should have won, ended up being lost. But unless the party becomes relaxed about the fact that we need to persuade people who have voted Tory to vote for us, then we are doomed to lose. Now, Jeanette rightly talks about the success we had in 2017, and absolutely, we did better than expected. Locally, the Tories here were convinced they were going to be winning seats like Bishop Auckland, but we held on and indeed made gains in the region here, and as well as gaining other university seats like Canterbury and Portsmouth. But let's be honest, the Corbyn surge was principally a middle-class surge, not a working-class surge. It was a very specific demographic appeal in the seats that changed hands. Indeed, we ended up losing seats in the East and West Midlands, losing seats in the former mining field communities, such as Mansfield and North East Derbyshire. Now, the statisticians continue to argue about the reality of the youthquake or not at the election. All I can say is from where I was, it certainly felt true. But the problem is we still lost. Labour still has fewer seats now than Neil Kinnock had after the 1992 general election. We need to win at least 60 seats at the next election, and the swings required are still significant. Why does any of this matter to tonight's debate? Because my argument is that Labour's success depends on recognising that while over time the people change, the policies change, the fundamental principles, those new Labour principles, don't change. They've been true every time the Labour Party has won, whether it is 1945, 1964 or 1997. A party of the centre-left can only win elections from the centre ground with a coalition that runs from north to south, that isn't class-based and willing to work with business to deliver real change. That is the political agenda that became defined as New Labour. And we can be proud of the achievements that there were, from peace in Northern Ireland through to transforming the landscape for LGBT people, from the national minimum wage to devolution. And indeed, I would remind Jeanette that the only reason we have a mayor or a London Assembly for Jeanette to be chair of is precisely because the New Labour government delivered it. And you can take the view that of the 5 times in Labour's history when it formed a working majority, it was Clement Attlee, Harold Wilson, Tony Blair, and Tony Blair. Now, you can take the view that those things are a coincidence, but my point is not to defend Tony personally. He's more than capable of doing that himself. The far more important thing is recognising the political folly of burying the New Labour philosophy. That's why I would say it's a state of mind, not a moment in time, or a personal fan club for one individual. But it is central to how we win again. Thank you.